screen disappeared, so Diana, I'll continue to rely on you for
I'll work the chat.
chats. Thank you. Okay, so section 5 was making sure that what's my job as the city's floodplain administrator. So the floodplain management requirements of the communities. So the requirements are in CFR section 50 or part 59 in part 60. Part 59 is primarily the definitions. It also has some of the requirements of the community to be in the program. This presentation will primarily focus on what's in part 60, and in particular 60.3. So the community types. This basically, and we'll go through what's in ABC later in the presentation. This basically says what are your community requirements based on what mapping is in your community. So if you're out on the eastern plains of Colorado and the flood program hasn't, the state's mapping program hasn't got to you yet, then you're very likely a community. If you have older maps and maybe they just touch the corner of your community and the rest of your community is unmapped, then you're a B, you know, and then it's a zone A, then you're a B community, etc. So as far as what your requirements are, you know, 4 basic rules we'll go through. You must use the latest maps. What's the effective map from FEMA or the effective data? There are a few exceptions. If the data doesn't agree with what's actually out there, maybe it's been changed over time. We've had situations where paper maps were converted to digital maps, and the GIS shapefile all of a sudden is 20 feet east of the stream. We've actually had maps that were converted 15 years ago show the floodplain entirely east of the tallweg of the stream. So that's where you've got to do some different management in those situations. If you don't have BFEs provided or the data is insufficient, you know, all of those are where you need to take the next step and say, okay, the map doesn't give me everything I need. Now what do I need to look at? One of the things that's required in an A community or anything higher than a parenthesis A community is the subdivision requirements. If you have a zone A crossing a piece of property and someone comes in with a subdivision proposal, if it's greater than 5 acres, or if they're proposing more than 50 lots, they have to then determine a flood elevation on that property. And then every piece of development that occurs within that subdivision has to follow the regulations as if it was a zone AE. So the examples of where that might occur. Here's a subdivision up in the top left. They've proposed more than 50 lots. So yes, they need to go in and determine a base flood elevation on that reach of zone A that affects that property. The bottom center, it's large lots, estate homes, potentially. They are greater than 5 acres, even though there's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lots that are in the flood zone A, they still need to determine base flood elevations because of their area. Now, the top right, it doesn't really go into it in the regulations, but in the manual that's provided, if the developer comes in and he shows up with his first proposal on the top left, and you're told him, hey, you got to go and do a study. He says, well, what if I cluster the homes and I move them all, and I just give you a big open space lot, and maybe that's going to become a park. In a situation like that, they may not have to go in and do elevation study. So there's a potential out there. But when they've determined a base flood elevation within their subdivision, that then needs to be filed within 6 months, and a letter of map revision is then issued. I have seen situations where as you go from bottom to top along a stream, you go zone A, and then there's a section of zone AE, and then you get up above where a LOMR had been filed, and you're back to a zone A. So that can occur. Rule 2, all development. A floodplain development permit is required for all development in the floodplain. So that's not just new construction. Here we've got a plywood and 2x4 home surrounded by trees. Anyone in the last month and a half in Colorado see an issue with that kind of construction? But that's not what we're here to talk about. Floodplains. So it's not just homes, wells, whether water wells, oil wells, mineral development, if you will. Someone's coming in, excavating in a utility. Any of those things trigger a requirement for a floodplain development permit. I think we've issued over 20 floodplain development permits, and so far this year, and fewer than a half dozen actually resulted in a permanent structure or a permanent change to the grading above grade. So rule 3, development should not increase the flood hazard on other properties beyond allowable limits. So again, here's what my job is. As the local floodplain administrator, I have to apply this rule. So if there's a regulatory floodway, what does that do? And in Colorado, the surcharge is 6 inches. The floodway's been mapped. The property owners on the right and left here can fill from the edge of the floodplain in towards the middle. It does have a net effect. It's raised the base flood elevation. That's the modeled surcharge. You're allowed to do that filling in the floodplain as long as it doesn't exceed 1 foot. That's probably the value that'll be on the test. That's the federal standard. Again, in Colorado, that's a 6-inch criteria. Floodways. Floodways require an encroachment review. So the property owner or the person that's proposing the project has to basically analyze what's going to be the impact of my work. You can do development in a floodway, but you have to come up with a no-rise certificate. That's not always impossible. You may be putting in a project that you've done fill in the floodplain, but you've also maybe done some excavation. I like to call that compensatory conveyance. It's not a term that's used in anywhere in the regulations, but that's how I try and put that concept out to people. You have to have the no-rise certification signed by a registered engineer. And then you keep that, we keep them with our floodplain development permits. So if you're doing work in the floodplain, the PE has to assert that if you're doing any work in the floodway, a PE has to assert that will not cause a rise. And then this last one we'll cover on the next slide. Development in a conveyance shadow may be permitted without an analysis. So here's the example that they use. You have the existing house. There's going to be an area on the upstream side of the house that, if you came in here and maybe put a stoop in or a deck or whatever in this area, it's not going to increase the base flood elevation. There's a longer shadow on the downstream end. Again, if you came in, you're going to do a patio, a deck, or whatever, maybe a small addition to the house. Any of those, they could say, hey, I'm in that shadow, and therefore I don't need to do a hydraulic analysis of this. But any new structure, any addition to that structure still needs to be above the base flood elevation. So you can't just go in and make an addition to the house, and maybe the existing portion of the house is below the BFE, and you're saying, hey, I'm just matching the walkout basement level in this new addition. Nope, anything new has to be above the BFE, even if it's in this shadow. So the encroachment reviews, and this is when you don't have a floodway. The analysis still has to say that it won't increase the water surface elevation more than a foot. And as noted in the box down at the bottom, in Colorado, that's a half foot. So this is analogous to having a floodway on the property, or a floodway having been determined, I should say. You can't just go into a zone A or a zone AE and start doing filling work. And when you do your analysis, you say, well, I've increased, by 0.62 feet, 7.5 inches is how much I've increased this base flood elevation, but I'm good. Well, in Colorado, that says, no, you can't do that. And a little asterisk, we'll come to it in the next slide. But this is what your encroachment review is going to reveal to you. One of the emphasis points on this that we talked about earlier is it's the cumulative effect of all development. So maybe a property owner is wanting to bring in fill on their property. Someone down the road is doing work, you're willing to take their fill. But you've got people coming in with proposals for grading out the entire property and putting in a mixed use of apartments and retail or whatever. The encroachment review has to look at that ultimate project. Maybe that's what your zoning allows, or someone, again, has a master plan for that area. You can't just say, well, I'm only doing fill, therefore I don't need to include that in my encroachment review. You have to look at what the ultimate is. And this is your responsibility as the local official. So it is allowable to increase the base flood elevation. You know, if you go in and you have a roadway that's overtopped in a minor flood and you're going to put in a bridge and you're going to raise the roadway above the base flood elevation, it's almost unavoidable to not cause a rise in the BFE upstream. You know, weirs are very efficient. You got a 300-foot long weir and you're going to over a roadway in essence, and you're going to replace that with a 60-foot bridge, it's almost inevitable that you're going to raise the base flood elevation. If that occurs, you have to apply for a CLOMR ahead of time. You have to notify all of the affected property owners. You have to document that you are in compliance with the Endangered Species Act. And here's another big kicker here. You can't impact an insurable structure. So you can't just go in and do fill on your property and 100 yards upstream in Colorado, in other states where floods, where the slope of a flood profile is a lot flatter, it might be a quarter mile or more upstream, that you've caused a rise on an insurable structure. Then that project won't be allowed. All right, rule number 4, new or substantially improved buildings or substantially damaged buildings, when they are restored, must be protected from the base flood elevations, or from the base flood, I should say. A residential structure has to be above the base flood elevation. Non-residential structures, and we'll get into that in a little bit, can still have part of the structure below the base flood elevation. And substantial damage is not just from flooding. You could have a structural loss due to a fire. You could have structural loss due to a tornado. If there is substantial damage, and the definition on that nominally is 50% or more of the pre-event value of the structure. I'm hoping that's covered somewhere else in more detail, but that's a key thing to remember. So you have a structure, tree falls on the corner of it, they've got damage, they need to come in and repair that. Is that going to trigger this rule? Probably not. Second scenario, you've got a structure, it's been damaged by fire, a lot of smoke damage through the building, some of it's structurally still sound, but there's a lot of work that needs to occur to bring that building back to habitability. That's going to be a substantially damaged building, and they can't just rebuild it exactly where it was if it's in the floodplain. So how do we work with this? Well, if it's a new building, asterisk, or a substantial improvement or a substantial damaged building, the methods of protection is on fill. It could be elevation on piles or columns or stem walls, or on walls or a crawl space. And we'll have some examples of that coming up. So basements and crawl spaces, if there's not openings provided, then a basement or a crawl space is considered the lowest floor. A basement is enclosed on all 4 sides below the adjacent grade. Crawl space also enclosed on all 4 sides or on multiple sides, more than 2 sides, those are some of the definitions that are in Part 59, for example. Go back and look up some of these definitions on when these rules will apply to you. In general, basements shouldn't be allowed in the special flood hazard area. You can have crawl spaces, and again, that's a means to elevate a structure. You can, in Colorado, have that enclosure that provides some protection from the elements. But it can't be occupied. You also have to have the flood vents, and we'll touch on that in the next slide. You have to have a minimum of 2. The 1 square inch per square foot guide that was referred to earlier. And they can only be used for storage, access, or parking. And it even gets more detailed in the handbook. It talks about seasonal storage. Maybe you're storing snow tires there, or lawn and garden equipment, or whatever. It really shouldn't be an extra closet, if you will, that's down in that crawl space. So these new buildings in the special flood hazard area, permissible uses, just talked about that. Building access, you'll see where a house is elevated. They have an enclosed area on the ground level, again, for security reasons, or maybe to provide a dry staircase up to the main house. That's all permissible, but you, again, have to allow the floodwaters to come in and equalize it. So you have to have these openings. They have to be certified by a PE that the openings are built correctly, and that they meet the size required for the structure. And they have to be close to the ground. If you have the openings higher up and you've got several feet of water up against that wall before it's allowed in, well, that causes hydrostatic issues, and with hydrostatic pressure on that wall can cause issues, and it could potentially fail. You can't put utilities in your crawl spaces. So furnaces, water heaters, air conditioning, compressors, your electrical panel for your building, none of that can be below the base flood elevation. So if your crawl space is below the base flood elevation, you can't have an underfloor furnace, for example, in that area. A lot of manufactured homes are retrofitted with things of that nature. Can't be below the base flood elevation. The other thing to emphasize on these openings, it is the net area. So if you've got a 16-inch by 8-inch opening, but you've got louvers on it, you no longer have 144 square inches of opening. You have to decrease it by the louvers or the screen or whatever. If you have parking in your underground area, or your crawl space area, if you will, the garage door cannot be considered as the opening. You can't come in and argue and say, oh, if a flood's coming, I'm going to open up the garage and that'll equalize it, so I don't need to have all these openings that rodents or worse yet, people can get into that area. Those don't count because you may not be home when the flood occurs. Now, you can have garage doors with openings in them, with the engineered openings in the garage door itself. Those openings within the garage door count, but the area of the garage door does not. So new buildings in the flood zones, when the enclosures are below the BFE, and this is only non-residential buildings. The walls have to be watertight. The structural components have to resist hydrostatic pressures. And again, your utilities have to be protected from the flood damage. So your furnaces, water heaters, electrical panels, AC compressors that serve the greater structure, or any of the structure, all of that has to be above the BFE, even though you have walls or floors below the BFE. It's always preferable in these situations to do elevation over flood proofing, but in certain situations, elevation's not preferable, and that's where you've got V zones, for example, or if filling is going to cause a significant issue with the floodplain. Goes all the way back to what we were saying earlier. If you're going to raise the base flood elevation, well, maybe you can't do filling in that situation. So what are the requirements as you go through the various levels of this? For a community, you still have to require permits for all construction. So if you're in a community that does not have any flood mapping, you have to do everything in your community has to get a permit as if it were in a floodplain. So they need to look at that. It could be on a high hill, fairly easy documentation. You always have to ensure that permits from all other agencies are applied for and received. So did they get a 404 permit? Did they get permits from the county? Maybe they have to have a permit from the sanitation district. Any permits that are required for that before you issue a floodplain development permit, you have to make sure that the applicant has applied for and received those. You always have to require development to be reasonably safe from flooding. On the MT2 form, local officials, in the fine print, you are signing that this development will be reasonably safe from flooding. So every community has to have these kinds of regulations, with the exception of the first bullet. Once you define floodplains, now you only have to require permits for all construction in the special flood hazard area. Everything else dealing with parentheses, a community, 60.3A, 60.3B now. B has to meet all of the A. This is where the subdivision requirement comes in. Now you've got mapped floodplains. So if a subdivision is proposed that any portion of the property, not the entire property, any portion of the property is touched by an A zone, you have to then follow that requirement to establish flood elevations in the adjoining reach of the stream. If there's any better information available, maybe there's historic data from the highway department, there's a culvert or a bridge crossing nearby, and they've got evidence of the roadway having overtopped, and especially it's downstream of you. Well, what was that elevation? Regulate to that if you don't have base flood elevations. You always have to require that manufactured homes, sheds, propane tanks, anything that can float away has to be anchored Those requirements are for B communities. Now we move up a notch. If in your community, flood elevations have been established, so you've got the zone AE somewhere in your community, again, require permits for everything in the special flood hazard area. Any requirements that were there for B communities carry forward to you. Now you have to require that the lowest floor of a residential building has to be elevated to or above the BFE. You have to require that the lowest floor of non-residential buildings are elevated or flood-proofed above the BFE. Manufactured homes have to be above the BFE be above the BFE on a permanent foundation and anchored. This is another nuance here. RVs in the special flood hazard area have to be on site fewer than 180 days, licensed and ready for highway use. The intent here is that you don't want these to become de facto residential structures, that someone's living in this RV in the floodplain, but hey, it's an RV, therefore I don't need this permit. So it can't be permanently hooked up to utilities. It has to be highway ready. It has to be licensed. So you can't have it up on blocks. Any of those things reverted as a manufactured home for regulation purposes. So make sure as your local officials, if someone's parking RVs in the floodplain, that they retain them as road-ready vehicles. Now we have zone AEs with floodways established in your community. So everything required before is still required. Now you have to get to the zero rise or no rise certification if the work is happening in the floodway. Again, it's not just fill, it's any work in the floodway has to receive a no rise or a zero rise certification. So buildings in V zones. One time a year we have to worry about this when we're presenting this to you folks, or I should say I have to worry about this when I'm presenting this to you. And then in Colorado, we're able to move away from that. But V zones are very important. If you're a Weather Channel geek like I am, they were all over Biloxi, Mississippi, talking about the flood surge coming in and the damage to structures from the wave actions of all the hurricanes that have happened. There's special protections required for buildings in V zones. So you'll need to know this for your exam. Review it in the handbook, because again, for us in Colorado, it's not necessarily intuitive. So you can't be over the water. You need to have your structure back on what's normally dry land. Sand dunes and mangroves along the coastlines are viewed as mitigating flood damage, so you can't be going in and cutting through a mangrove area. You can't be cutting down sand dunes in order to build a structure in a V zone. Has to be elevated on piles or columns. If you do have walls, they have to be engineered as breakaway walls. And the handbook gets into more detail on that. Before you get to the base flood elevation in a V zone, that wall needs to fail. So you also have to be landward of the mean high tide. So again, you don't want a high tide coming in and being up underneath this structure. We'll see this on the next slide. The reference elevation now is the bottom of the lowest structural member, whereas for an A zone, as shown here, the reference elevation is the lowest floor. So in a V zone, here's your reference elevation. So this concrete slab that this grade beam is set upon, that's the reference elevation in a V zone. Concrete slab, and you've got the wood structure here. The reference elevation is still the top of that floor if you're in an A zone. Elevated structure in a V zone, what's the bottom of that structural beam? In an A zone, what's the top of the structural beam? This exhibit's right out of the handbook. So new buildings in a V zone. The other thing once you look at is making sure that your pile is adequately embedded. These have to be certified by a professional engineer. So they want you to look at what's the scour zone going to be, your embedded length for calculating the adequate structural embedment is not this depth, it's this depth. So the storm's already scoured away several feet of the ground underneath your structure in the middle of the storm. Maybe or in the middle of a flood, if you're along the Mississippi River, for example. This is all scoured away. You still need to have adequate structural embedment for that piling. And that's the end of the slides for this segment. Questions?
Yes, and those questions can come if you have questions on any of these units that were presented today, just let us know.
Insurable structure. That is covered in the handbook. An insurable structure is fully enclosed. Where's Diana? I'm gonna
right here.
Friend. Oh, there we go.
So there's a definition for floodplain management, and there's a definition for insurance. So for floodplain management, it is an enclosed building, at least 50% above grade on a permanent foundation. Now for insurance purposes, it's 2 walls and a roof on a permanent foundation, principally above ground. So if your pump house is below grade, how far is it below grade? Is it more than 50%? It's you have to look at that. That then is not an insurable structure on the insurance side, because more than 50% is below grade, including the piping.
Yeah. So here's out of section 59, as Diane was calling, the 2 or more outside walls, a roof. That's considered a structure for the regulations.
Yeah, what you have to remember is it is development. And as development, it's got to meet your floodplain management requirements. It's the same way with septic tanks. We don't cover on the insurance side, septic tanks because they're below grade, but it's still development. So there are certain things you have to look at when dealing with septic tanks, make sure that they are, downside and is not going to be infiltrated by water. So it's things like that you have to think about.
And maybe the question goes back to my earlier emphasis on, if you cause if your project, you're coming in for a clomer and you show that there's a rise in the flood elevation, if it hits an insurable, or if it causes a rise against an upstream insurable structure, then it's not permitted. So in that regard, a pump house or auxiliary shed may not be considered an insurable structure. But back to the point Diane was just making, if you're placing one of those in the floodplain, that's a development that then needs an analysis. So you can't just bring in a 10-foot by 15-foot tough shed and place it in your property, but then that in turn causes a rise in the base flood elevation. Well, it's not an insurable structure necessarily.
If it's got two walls and a roof, but it's got to be tied down to a permanent foundation.
Thank you. Okay, so let me use a different example. You're putting in a carport but you're enclosing it on only one side or two sides. But that one enclosed side, maybe you're going to put some cabinets up against it for storing, jumper cables and windshield washer fluid or whatever. But that one side is perpendicular to the flow of the stream. You still need to analyze the development that's being proposed, even if that's not an insurable structure.
Correct. So to answer the FEMA 480, you can also, you can Google that. That's requirements for floodplain management is the title of that, desk reference. You can get that on the FEMA website also, as well as ASFPM. It might be easier to find it on ASFPM because we've just redone our FEMA website and it sucks.
Yeah, and the email that Chris initially sent out had that link. I was able to download the most current 480 from that.
Is that the ASFPM website?
I
believe it was.
Thank you, Chris. Okay.
It
I'll
hasn't.
have to download that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think they need to update it. It hasn't been updated in a while.
They're working on that. Of course, our floodplain management requirements haven't changed in a whole bunch of years either. So, but it's guidance that we provide out there. I know they're updating it for we have a new agricultural policy that's out there. So I know they're updating to include that into it.
So we were scheduled to go till noon. We can cover questions for anything that came up this morning.
Yeah, Marta sent me a question. Can you clarify the difference between grade elevation and reference elevation? I think if you go back to your figure, it's kind of self-evident, but I could be wrong. The grade elevation is associated with the ground elevation adjacent to the property.
Is this for the ECs?
Well, when she says reference elevation, I think it was in the figure that you showed relating to the coastal V zones, the lowest.
You go back to that slide or that reference?
Yeah, that's where I was getting to now.
The underside of the lowest horizontal member.
Yeah, and while you're doing that, just a note on that, in the unnumbered A zone, 5 acres, 50 lots, That is for the project, not for a phase. So if somebody wants to come into you and say, well, phase one is going to do this and it's only going to be 4 acres and 30 lots. Well, what's the whole project going to be? And if it meets 5 acres or 50 lots, then they have to determine the base flood. I don't know if you said that. I was doing some chat at that time, so.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And it goes back to the other bullet that we've been pinging on, and that is, what's the full expected development?
Correct.
You know, so you can't come in and incrementally say, okay, well, I'm only going through the entitlement process for 4.5 acres this go round. And then you come back a year and a half later after those lots build out and say, I'm going for another 4.3 acres entitlement this go round. No, as the local officials, you need to really require them to look at what's the full development going to be that's envisioned for this site. Chris, can you re-ask the question now that I found the slide?
Sure. It's Marta asks, can you clarify the difference between grade elevation and reference elevation?
Okay, so the adjacent grade, what's the ground elevation? And this is going to show up on your elevation certificates as well. What's the grade touching the structure? The lowest adjacent grade touching the structure, or the adjacent grade, and depending on in the exercise, and also one of the highest adjacent grade. Whereas your reference grade is, where is the structure itself? So we actually had a situation come up where a LOMR had been done, and this was about 15 years ago. And when they did the study, they surveyed several houses that were slabs on grade, and determined that the houses weren't in the flood elevation, or so they thought at the time, and the map was showing it that way. Property owner, maybe the property changed hands, property owner goes for a federally backed mortgage company says, up, you've got floodplain on your property, you're going to need flood insurance. And they said, no, the structure's not in it. Well, they had to get an elevation certificate, and the lowest adjacent grade was below the base flood elevation by a few tenths, even though the lowest slab, so the reference elevation here, was above the base flood elevation. So the house was compliant, but they still needed to have flood insurance. So it was really a fine line there, and really frustrating for them and us, because we thought they were okay. So that's where adjacent grade and the reference grade. So thank you for that question, to have us drill down a little deeper on that.
Yeah, and keep in mind, a lender has to require if the structure's in the floodplain, but when they do their zone determination, the zone determination is usually going to be on the property, not on the structure. A lot of times it's done electronically and nobody ever looks at a map. If they've done a determination before and it was in an A zone, it's going to stay in A zone until it's proved that the structure is out. But a bank under the mortgage contract, or a lender under the mortgage contract, can require flood insurance regardless. It's just, how do we rate it? So if they got the letter of map amendment or letter of map revision based on fill or whatever, and it showed it out, then we'd rate it that way, but the bank can still require flood insurance.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I've fielded that question, I don't know how many times, and we don't have a lot of floodplain structures in Thornton. You know, you may get the preferred rate policy because a determination is made for the structure, or maybe you even go and get an elevation certificate and you get a LOMA that says the structure is not in the floodplain. Then you get the preferred risk policy. They can still require you to have that. You've
Yes.
got two options: get the flood insurance or find another lender.
Exactly.
But
And
if the structure's in the floodplain and if it's a federally backed insurance, so VA, FHA,
federally backed mortgage, yeah.
yeah, thank you, federally backed mortgage, then they must require you to have flood insurance if the structure is in the floodplain. The example I was citing earlier, that homeowner went for a LOMA, and because the lowest adjacent grade was touching the edge of the slab, FEMA made a determination that they were not out of
Yeah.
the floodplain.
Yeah, it's all or nothing. If any part of the building is in the floodplain, the whole building is in.
So Tamarta's clarifying, grade elevation equals based on natural ground. Now, the lowest adjacent grade, you can provide fill up against a structure. It's not the natural grade that existed prior to your structure being built. You know, some people, going back to the stem wall discussion, or buildings being, preference towards elevated buildings, because you want someone to be able to walk out onto dry ground even during the base flood. So they may come in and place fill up against a stem wall or up against a crawl space wall, maybe even just on one side of the structure. It's whatever the ground is at the time of the elevation certificate or at the time of the insurance review. What's the ground elevation against the structure? I hope I clarify that and not confused it more.
Andrea asks if there are any practice problems we could get somewhere. I thought I remembered seeing questions within that FEMA 480, but I was quickly going through it and I didn't see it there. But I know on ASFPM's website there are supplemental information that may have questions as practice problems, but I'm not exactly recalling exactly where.
So Kevin Houck and myself and our MT1 expert at the region are having a conversation privately. And I'm confused on this because what he says is one thing, but it kind of means it's a letters of map revision based on fill has to have both the lowest adjacent grade and the lowest floor above BFE. Whereas the LOMA does not. So I'll put that clarification out there. And if a letter of map revision based on fill is submitted, the case will, and the lowest floor is not above the base flood, they will issue a violation and send it to the region to determine whether or not it needs to be processed or stopped. So letters of map revision based on fill I would, and I think we need to have it on Lomas also. The lowest floor needs to be at or above the base flood.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that slide that I presented doesn't need
Was
to be
correct.
updated. Okay,
Was correct.
yes.
But I know of several ones that have been processed. Now, it may be that FEMA said, go ahead and process it. Whatever, it wasn't in this region, it was in another region. And it went through, but my personal opinion, you know, is having done floodplain management for 2 years in the coastal areas, I think both of them need to be at base flood. The lowest floor has to be at or above base flood. We're just asking for trouble if not.
Thank you, Pam, for identifying that the questions were in Appendix H of that 480. I just didn't go far enough to see. So there are practice type questions that's located at the end of FEMA 480, that guidance document.
All right.
It seems like the questions are slowing down. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. We'll see everybody tomorrow. Thank you to the presenters in instruction and providing your knowledge. It's definitely very helpful and I appreciate it.
And we all make mistakes. We learn everything too. We learn things too.
Right.
Very true. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We'll see you
Thanks.
all tomorrow.
See you all in the morning.
Take care.